Tonight we're traveling back to a time long before dispensaries, before prohibition, before anyone debated THC percentages or argued about legalization. You're standing in a windswept valley somewhere in Central Asia thousands of years ago. A small fire burns. Someone tosses a handful of strange leaves into the flames. The smoke rises slowly into the cold night air. And something unusual happens. People begin to laugh. Someone starts singing. Another stares at the stars like they're seeing them for the very first time. Before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy wandering into these quieter, stranger corners of history with me. And if you'd like, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I like knowing how far these stories travel. Now let's begin. Long before cannabis became controversial, it was simply a plant humans stumbled into. And once they discovered what it could do to the mind, history quietly changed. Long before anyone gave the plant a name, long before governments banned it or scientists analyzed its chemistry, cannabis was simply part of the landscape. Imagine standing on a wide Central Asian plain roughly 10,000 years ago, a place where the wind travels freely across rolling grasslands and the sky seems impossibly large. The climate shifts between cold winters and warm, dry summers, and scattered across the valleys and riverbanks are dense patches of a tall, resilient plant with jagged leaves and fibrous stems. To the animals that graze nearby, it is just another species among many. To early humans wandering through these environments, it is one more plant among thousands that might offer something useful. Prehistoric Central Asia was an ecological crossroads where different climates and ecosystems overlapped. Rivers flowed down from mountain ranges such as the Altai and the Tian Shan, carving fertile valleys where wild plants thrived. Among these plants grew wild varieties of cannabis, what we now call hemp, thriving in disturbed soils near water sources and open grasslands. The plant was unusually hardy. It could grow quickly, adapt to different conditions, and spread its seeds easily through wind and animals brushing past the tall stalks. Because of this resilience, cannabis did not need careful cultivation to exist. It simply appeared wherever the conditions allowed it, sometimes growing in thick stands that stretched across entire hillsides. Early human groups traveling through these landscapes would have encountered it frequently, without realizing its future significance. These early people were hunter-gatherers, whose survival depended on noticing small details in their environment. They needed to know which berries could be eaten safely, which roots could be boiled into something nourishing, and which plants might cause sickness or death. Knowledge of plants accumulated slowly, passed through observation, trial, and memory. Some plants were valued for food, others for medicine, and some for entirely practical uses that had nothing to do with eating them. When prehistoric humans looked at cannabis, the first thing they likely noticed was not its psychoactive potential, but its structure. The stalks were tough and fibrous, stronger than many other plants in the region. If you stripped away the outer layers of the stem, inside you found long strands of fiber that could be twisted and braided into cord. For early societies that depended heavily on tools made from natural materials, this kind of fiber was extremely valuable. Rope and cordage were essential technologies long before metal tools existed. With rope you could secure shelters, bind together hunting equipment, create fishing nets, and carry goods more efficiently. A plant that naturally produced strong fibers would quickly attract attention. Archaeological evidence suggests that hemp fibers may have been among the earliest plant fibers humans deliberately processed. Ancient fragments of hemp cord and textiles discovered in parts of East Asia suggest that people were experimenting with the plant thousands of years ago. Even if the earliest encounters in Central Asia were accidental, it would not take long for curious humans to start testing what the plant could do. Prehistoric experimentation was rarely systematic in the modern sense, but it was persistent. Someone would strip the bark from a stalk and twist the fibers together. Someone else might notice that the dried stems burned slowly and steadily in fires. Seeds might have been collected and eaten during times when other food sources were scarce. Over generations, this process of gradual discovery transformed ordinary plants into essential resources. Cannabis, growing freely across large regions, would have been an easy candidate for such experimentation. Wild hemp fields in prehistoric Central Asia, likely created striking visual patterns across the landscape during the late summer growing season. The plants could grow several feet tall, forming dense clusters with broad leaves that caught sunlight. As winds moved through the plains, the stalks would sway together, producing a rustling sound not unlike tall grasses. To wandering human groups, these fields would stand out from surrounding vegetation. Even without recognizing its full potential, they would notice the plant simply because it appeared so frequently. Plants that grow everywhere tend to become part of everyday life, whether people intend it or not. Seeds might cling to clothing or animal fur. Stalks might be collected casually for fuel or bedding. Over time, familiarity breeds curiosity. Humans have always possessed a remarkable ability to recognize patterns and possibilities within their environment. When a plant appears repeatedly in places where humans live and travel, eventually someone begins to wonder what else it might offer. The discovery of useful plants was one of the quiet engines of early human development. Long before agriculture formally emerged, hunter-gatherers were already shaping ecosystems through selective gathering and replanting. If a plant proved particularly useful, people might carry its seeds with them as they moved across territories. This informal cultivation gradually altered the distribution of species. Cannabis, with its adaptable seeds and rapid growth, would have spread easily along human migration routes. Each new settlement or campsite might unintentionally become a small center of hemp growth simply because seeds were dropped nearby. Over centuries, this relationship between humans and the plant deepened. What began as a wild species growing unnoticed on the steppe slowly became a familiar companion in human settlements. At first, its value lay in its fibers. Hemp rope was strong enough to hold together wooden structures or bind tools. Fishing nets made from hemp could stretch across river channels, catching fish that might otherwise escape. Even simple tasks like carrying bundles of firewood became easier when sturdy cordage was available. These practical advantages would have reinforced the plant's importance in daily life. Yet prehistoric plant discovery rarely remained limited to a single use. Once a community becomes familiar with a species, people inevitably experiment with other parts of it. Seeds might be roasted or ground into coarse meal. Leaves might be added to fires for scent or smoke. Roots might be tested for medicinal effects. The plant gradually reveals its complexity through repeated interaction. In the case of cannabis, the seeds offered nutritional value, containing oils and proteins that could supplement early diets. While not a primary food source, they would have been a welcome addition during lean seasons when hunting was unpredictable. The seeds could also be stored for later use, making them valuable in early attempts at seasonal planning. Central Asia during this prehistoric era was not an isolated wilderness, but a dynamic region through which many human groups traveled. Seasonal migrations brought different communities into contact with one another, and knowledge often spread along the same routes as trade goods and cultural practices. If one group discovered a particularly useful plant fiber, neighboring groups might learn about it through observation or exchange. Cannabis may have traveled this way across the Eurasian steppe long before not every plant produced strong psychoactive compounds. Early humans encountering these wild populations might simply see a useful fiber crop rather than a mind-altering substance. Still, the stage was quietly being set for future discoveries. When a plant becomes deeply integrated into human daily life, opportunities arise for new observations. Someone tending a fire might notice that certain leaves produce unusually fragrant smoke. Someone experimenting with seeds or flowers might feel slightly different afterward. These moments of curiosity accumulate slowly, sometimes across generations. But the first step in that process was simply the plant's presence in the landscape. Cannabis did not need to be planted deliberately in prehistoric Central Asia. It grew everywhere already. It was there in the valleys, along the rivers, in the disturbed soils near early campsites. Its fibers offered strength, its seeds offered nourishment, and its resilience ensured that it would remain part of the environment no matter how often humans used it. In this quiet way, long before the plant became controversial or celebrated, cannabis entered human history not as a drug but as a useful neighbor in the wild fields of Central Asia. The first chapter of cannabis in human history begins on the windswept plains of Central Asia. The next chapter appears quietly along the coastlines and river valleys of ancient East Asia. Long before written language, long before organized agriculture reshaped landscapes, humans were already experimenting with plants in ways that would slowly transform their relationship with the natural world. Archaeological discoveries suggest that cannabis was not only present in these early societies but actively used by them in ways that reveal just how important the plant became. Some of the earliest evidence comes from sites in ancient Taiwan, where archaeologists have uncovered fragments of pottery dating back roughly 12,000 years. These fragments contain something unusual embedded in their surfaces, the impressions of twisted plant fibers that had once been pressed into the clay before it hardened. When researchers examined these impressions closely, they found that the fibers matched the structure of hemp. The discovery suggests that by around 10,000 BCE, humans were already harvesting cannabis plants and processing their fibers into usable materials. This is significant not because of intoxication or ritual, but because it reveals that cannabis was already part of one of humanity's earliest technological revolutions, the creation of rope and textiles. Rope may sound like a simple invention, but in prehistoric societies it was a transformative tool. Without strong cordage, early humans were limited in how they could build shelters, trap animals, secure tools, or transport resources. The ability to twist plant fibers into durable rope expanded what people could do with the materials around them. A rope made from hemp could bind wooden poles together to form sturdy frames for shelters, allowing communities to construct more reliable homes rather than relying on temporary structures. Rope could also be woven into nets that dramatically improved fishing efficiency, enabling early coastal populations to harvest large numbers of fish from rivers and shorelines. When archaeologists study the development of early human technology, they often focus on stone tools because stone survives in the archaeological record, but perishable materials like fiber and wood were equally important, even if they rarely survive long enough to be preserved. The impressions of hemp fibers found in ancient pottery therefore provide a rare glimpse into technologies that would otherwise be invisible. Those faint marks in clay represent countless hours of human labor spent gathering stalks, stripping fibers, twisting them together, and experimenting with ways to make them stronger and more flexible. The process of turning cannabis stalks into usable fiber is not particularly complicated, but it requires knowledge and patience. After harvesting the plant, the stalks must be soaked or retted to loosen the fibers from the woody core. Once separated, the fibers can be dried and combed, then twisted or braided into threads. Early humans likely learned this process gradually through experimentation, discovering that the tough outer bark of the cannabis stem contained long fibers that could be extracted with enough effort. Once the method was understood, hemp would have quickly become one of the most valuable plants available to prehistoric communities. The plant's usefulness did not end with rope. Hemp fibers could also be woven into primitive textiles, allowing early societies to create cloth long before complex looms were invented. Simple weaving techniques could produce mats, baskets, or garments that provided protection from weather and insects. In colder regions, these materials would have been especially valuable, offering insulation and durability that animal hides alone could not always provide. Hemp textiles also had another advantage. The plant grew quickly and could be harvested repeatedly. Unlike animal hides, which required hunting, hemp could potentially be cultivated or encouraged to grow near settlements. This may be one of the earliest hints that cannabis was moving from wild resource toward early agricultural crop. The transition from gathering wild plants to deliberately cultivating them marks one of the most important shifts in human history. Agriculture allowed societies to settle permanently, support larger populations, and eventually build cities. While crops like wheat and rice are often highlighted as the foundations of early agriculture, plants such as hemp played crucial supporting roles. Hemp may not have been eaten as a primary food source, but its fibers were so useful that communities had strong incentives to ensure the plant was always available. If people noticed that cannabis plants grew particularly well near their campsites or along riverbanks where seeds had fallen, they may have begun encouraging those plants to grow deliberately. Seeds could be scattered in favorable soil, and the strongest plants might be harvested while leaving others to produce future crops. This kind of informal cultivation often precedes true agriculture by thousands of years. Instead of fields carefully planted in rows, early farmers simply learned how to guide natural growth patterns to their advantage. Cannabis was perfectly suited for this kind of early domestication. The plant grows quickly, tolerates different climates, and produces large quantities of fiber within a single season. It also produces seeds that can survive long periods of dormancy, allowing the plant to reappear year after year, even if humans move away from a settlement. These characteristics made hemp a dependable resource for early communities who were still learning how to manage their environments. The archaeological evidence from Taiwan suggests that hemp fiber technology was already widespread enough 12,000 years ago to leave clear marks in pottery and other artifacts. This means that knowledge of hemp processing had likely been developing for generations before that time. Somewhere in East Asia, people had discovered not only that cannabis stalks contained useful fibers, but also how to extract and manipulate them efficiently. Once that knowledge existed, it could spread rapidly across neighboring regions. Trade networks in prehistoric Asia allowed ideas and materials to move surprisingly far, even without written communication. A group that developed particularly strong rope or finely woven hemp cloth might attract attention from neighboring communities. Through observation or exchange, these techniques could travel along migration routes and river valleys, reaching new populations who would adapt them to local conditions. As hemp technology spread, the plant's role in human society expanded. It became more than a wild plant growing along riverbanks. It became a dependable material that people relied on daily. Farmers needed hemp rope to secure livestock or bind harvested crops. Fishermen needed hemp nets to catch fish efficiently. Travelers needed hemp cords to tie together bundles of goods. Even simple tasks like repairing tools or building baskets often required sturdy fibers that only certain plants could provide. Because of these practical demands, cannabis gradually became one of the earliest plants humans treated as a cultivated resource, rather than a wild curiosity. Unlike grains that required careful planting and irrigation, hemp could thrive in relatively untended fields. This made it an ideal early agricultural plant for societies still transitioning from nomadic lifestyles to more settled communities. Hemp could be grown near villages without demanding the intensive labor required by food crops, yet it provided materials that made daily life easier and more efficient. Over time, this quiet partnership between humans and cannabis shaped the plant itself. When people repeatedly harvest certain plants and leave others to reproduce, they unintentionally select for traits that benefit human use. In the case of hemp, plants with longer fibers and stronger stalks would have been favored for rope and textile production. Those plants would be more likely to produce seeds for future generations, gradually shifting the genetic makeup of cannabis populations. This process of unconscious domestication happened slowly, often without people realizing they were shaping the species they depended on. By the time written records eventually appear thousands of years later, cannabis had already become deeply integrated into human technology and agriculture, but its earliest role was not as a source of intoxication or medicine. It was simply a plant whose fibers helped solve practical problems. The evidence preserved in ancient Taiwanese pottery reminds us that before cannabis became famous or controversial, it was valued for something far simpler: the strength of its fibers and the quiet usefulness of a plant that grew readily wherever humans settled. For thousands of years, cannabis had quietly served human societies as a plant of utility. Its fibers bound tools and shelters together. Its seeds supplemented diets, and its hardy stalks grew reliably wherever soil and sunlight allowed. But somewhere along the long timeline of human experimentation with plants, another aspect of cannabis began to reveal itself. The leaves and flowers, when exposed to heat, produce smoke with unusual properties. At first, this discovery may have been accidental, the result of dried plant material thrown into a fire for fuel or fragrance. Smoke drifting through a tent or shelter might have produced subtle changes in perception, laughter among those nearby, or a strange calm settling over the group. Over generations, such experiences would not remain mysterious for long. Humans have always been attentive observers of cause and effect, especially when those effects alter the mind itself. The earliest clear archaeological evidence that people were deliberately using cannabis for its psychoactive effects comes from a remarkable discovery in western China. In the high desert region of the Pamir Mountains, archaeologists excavated a burial site dating back roughly 2,500 years. The location sits along what would later become part of the Silk Road, a vast network of trade routes connecting East Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. At the time these graves were created, however, the region was not yet a bustling corridor of international trade. Instead, it was home to small communities living among stark mountain valleys, where life was shaped by harsh winters, thin air, and the rhythms of pastoral migration. When researchers began examining the graves, they discovered something unusual placed alongside the human remains. Scattered around several burial chambers were small wooden braziers, shallow bowls carved from wood, each containing stones that had clearly been heated by fire. At first, the braziers appeared similar to objects used in many ancient cultures to burn incense or aromatic plants during ceremonies, but chemical analysis of the residue left on the stones revealed something far more specific. Traces of cannabis compounds were embedded in the charred material coating the interior of the braziers. Even more intriguing was the chemical profile of the residue. The cannabis found in these braziers appeared to contain unusually high levels of psychoactive compounds compared to wild hemp typically used for fiber. This suggests that the people using these braziers were not simply burning random plant matter. They were selecting cannabis specifically for its mind-altering properties. The discovery provided one of the clearest pieces of evidence that ancient humans were intentionally inhaling cannabis smoke as part of ritual activity thousands of years ago. The braziers themselves were simple but effective devices. By placing hot stones inside a wooden bowl and scattering dried plant material on top, smoke could be produced slowly without open flames. Participants in the ritual would likely sit around the brazier inside an enclosed space, perhaps a tent or small chamber, allowing the smoke to accumulate in the air. Inhaling the smoke would gradually produce psychoactive effects, altering mood and perception in ways that might feel profound or spiritual. The setting of these braziers inside burial sites strongly suggests that the smoke was not merely recreational. Instead, it likely played a role in funerary ceremonies, moments when communities gathered to mourn the dead and perhaps attempt to communicate with the spiritual world. Many ancient cultures believed that altered states of consciousness allowed humans to cross the boundary between ordinary reality and the realm of spirits or ancestors. Cannabis smoke may have been used as a bridge between those worlds. Participants in the ritual could inhale the smoke while chanting, singing, or performing other ceremonial acts, entering a shared state of altered awareness that gave emotional intensity to the burial process. The Pamir Mountains themselves may have contributed to the potency of the cannabis used in these rituals. High-altitude environments often stress plants in ways that increase the production of certain chemical compounds. Some researchers believe that cannabis growing in these mountainous regions naturally developed higher levels of psychoactive cannabinoids. If ancient people noticed that certain plants produce stronger effects than others, they may have deliberately gathered cannabis from these high-altitude areas for ceremonial purposes. This kind of selective gathering represents an early step toward intentional cultivation for psychoactive properties. Instead of treating cannabis solely as a fiber crop, communities may have begun distinguishing between varieties that produced useful stalks and varieties that produced stronger smoke. Such distinctions would mark a significant shift in how humans interacted with the plant. The burial site itself contained dozens of graves arranged in a pattern suggesting organized community rituals. Wooden poles were placed above some graves, possibly serving as markers or symbolic structures. The braziers were not randomly scattered but positioned deliberately within the burial spaces. This careful placement indicates that the smoke ceremonies were integrated into the process of honoring the dead. It is easy to imagine a group gathered in the thin mountain air, surrounding the burial chamber while smoke curled upward from the heated stones. The scent of burning cannabis would mix with the cold wind sweeping across the plateau, creating an atmosphere that felt both solemn and otherworldly. As the smoke filled the enclosed space, those present might feel their senses shifting. Colors could seem slightly brighter, sounds slightly more resonant. Conversations might become reflective or philosophical. In many cultures, altered states are interpreted as moments when the veil between worlds grows thinner. The smoke could have been seen as a tool for guiding the spirit of the deceased into the afterlife, or for allowing the living to feel closer to those who had passed away. The discovery of these braziers changed the way archaeologists understood early cannabis use. Previously, evidence had focused mostly on hemp fibers or seeds, suggesting that the plant's primary importance lay in its practical applications. The Pamir burial site revealed something more complex. By 500 BCE, at least some communities were already using cannabis specifically for its psychoactive effects, and doing so within structured ceremonial settings. This suggests that knowledge of the plant's mind-altering properties had spread widely enough to become integrated into ritual traditions. Such knowledge likely did not appear suddenly. It probably developed gradually as people experimented with different plants during fires, feasts, and ceremonies. Over time, certain plants would be recognized as producing reliable psychological effects when burned or consumed. Once a plant gained that reputation, it could become associated with spiritual practice. Cannabis may have followed exactly this path, moving from accidental discovery to deliberate ritual use across generations. The Pamir braziers also hint at the social dimension of early cannabis consumption. The smoke was not inhaled alone but shared among groups during significant communal events. This collective experience may have reinforced social bonds, allowing participants to feel connected not only to each other, but to the spiritual beliefs surrounding the ceremony. Shared altered states can create powerful emotional memories, strengthening traditions that communities repeat over time. The location of the burial site along ancient travel routes may have helped spread these practices further. Traders and travelers passing through the region would encounter local customs and carry stories of them back to their own communities. If cannabis smoke rituals were seen as meaningful or impressive, they might inspire similar ceremonies elsewhere. In this way, the knowledge of cannabis as a psychoactive plant could travel across cultures long before written records documented its use. What began as a plant growing quietly in the fields of Central Asia was now becoming something more symbolic. In the burial chambers of the Pamir Mountains, cannabis was no longer just fiber or seed. It was smoke rising in the cold mountain air, a substance capable of shifting perception and shaping ritual moments that connected the living with the dead. By the time the ancient Greek historian Herodotus began writing about the distant lands beyond the Black Sea in the 5th century BCE, cannabis had already traveled far from the quiet fields where it once grew unnoticed. It had moved along trade routes, passed between cultures, and taken on new meanings in different societies. But one of the most vivid early descriptions of its psychoactive use comes not from an archaeological discovery, but from a piece of writing that has survived for over 2,000 years. Herodotus, often called the father of history, recorded stories about a nomadic people known as the Scythians, a confederation of horse-riding tribes who roamed the vast grasslands stretching across Central Asia and Eastern Europe. The Scythians were famous among neighboring civilizations for their skill in warfare and their mobility. They lived much of their lives on horseback, moving with their herds across the open steppe, where permanent cities were rare and the horizon seemed endless. Yet despite their reputation as fierce warriors, Herodotus also described something about their culture that fascinated him deeply, a ritual involving cannabis smoke that he compared to a kind of steam bath, unlike anything known in the Greek world. According to Herodotus, after funerals or certain ceremonial gatherings, the Scythians would perform a purification ritual inside small tents constructed from felt or animal hides stretched over wooden poles. These portable structures could be assembled quickly, making them ideal for nomadic groups who rarely stayed in one place for long. Once the tent was sealed, participants would bring heated stones inside and place them in a shallow pit or container. Then they would throw hemp seeds or other parts of the cannabis plant onto the hot stones. Almost immediately, the plant material would begin to smolder, releasing thick clouds of aromatic smoke that filled the enclosed space. Herodotus wrote that the Scythians would sit inside the tent while the smoke billowed around them, inhaling deeply as the air grew dense with the scent of burning cannabis. The experience, he claimed, caused them to shout and laugh loudly, overcome with a kind of ecstatic joy. To Greek readers accustomed to the quiet heat of bathhouses or the gentle fragrance of incense, The idea of warriors intentionally filling a tent with intoxicating smoke must have seemed both exotic and slightly bewildering. Yet for the Scythians, this ritual was not strange at all. It was simply part of their cultural rhythm, something done to cleanse the body and spirit after important events. Herodotus described the ritual as a substitute for bathing in water, which was less practical for nomadic societies living in regions where rivers might be distant or frozen for much of the year. Instead of immersing themselves in water like the Greeks, the Scythians created a kind of smoke sauna. The heated stones produced warmth while the cannabis smoke thickened the air, creating an environment where sweat and intoxication mingled. Participants would remain inside until the experience reached its peak, emerging afterward refreshed and perhaps still laughing from the effects of the smoke. The historian noted with some amazement that the Scythians considered this process far superior to ordinary bathing, praising the smoke bath as both cleansing and invigorating. While Herodotus's account might sound exaggerated to modern readers, archaeological discoveries have provided evidence that supports at least parts of his description. Excavations in regions once inhabited by Scythian tribes have uncovered containers and braziers containing cannabis residue, along with artifacts associated with ritual gatherings inside tents or enclosed structures. These findings suggest that the practice of burning cannabis on heated stones was not simply a traveler's tale, but a genuine cultural tradition among certain steppe communities. The nomadic lifestyle of the Scythians likely played an important role in shaping the ritual itself. Unlike agricultural societies that built permanent temples or bathhouses, the Scythians carried their homes and ceremonial spaces with them wherever they traveled. Their tents served not only as shelters, but also as social centers where stories were told, alliances negotiated, and rituals performed. When a group gathered inside one of these tents, the enclosed space created an intimate environment where shared experiences could become powerful communal events. Adding cannabis smoke to that environment transformed an ordinary gathering into something more intense and memorable. The warriors described by Herodotus were not simply relaxing after a long day. They were participating in a ritual that blended purification, social bonding, and altered consciousness. Laughter, according to the historian, was a natural response to the smoke filling the tent. In a world where life on the steppe could be harsh and unpredictable, moments of shared joy may have carried special significance. The ritual might follow a funeral ceremony or another emotionally charged event, allowing participants to release tension through both the heat of the smoke bath and the psychological effects of cannabis inhalation. For nomadic warriors accustomed to constant movement and occasional violence, such moments of communal release could strengthen social ties and reinforce group identity. The ritual also likely held symbolic meaning beyond simple relaxation. Many ancient cultures believed that smoke carried prayers or spirits upward toward the heavens. Inhaling smoke, therefore, could be interpreted as participating in a cycle where humans and the spiritual world briefly overlapped. The Scythian smoke bath might have been understood as a moment when the boundaries between the ordinary and the sacred became less rigid. Participants entering the tent would leave behind the cold wind of the steppe and step into a warm cloud of fragrant smoke, where perception itself shifted slightly. Within that environment, laughter might be seen not just as amusement, but as a sign that the ritual was working, that purification and transformation were taking place. Herodotus' fascination with the Scythians reflects a broader curiosity among ancient civilizations about cultures beyond their borders. The Greek world had its own rituals involving wine, incense, and sacred plants, but the Scythian smoke bath seemed especially unusual because it combined elements of bathing, intoxication, and ceremony in a single event. For the historian writing from the perspective of a Mediterranean society, the idea of warriors shouting with laughter inside a smoke-filled tent must have felt both mysterious and captivating. Yet his account also reveals something universal about human societies: the tendency to create rituals that alter consciousness in ways that bring people together. Whether through wine, chanting, dance, or smoke, communities throughout history have sought moments when ordinary awareness shifts and collective emotion rises. The Scythian hotbox, as it might be called today, was simply one expression of that impulse. What makes this particular ritual so memorable is the vividness of Herodotus's description. More than 2 millennia later, readers can still imagine the scene: a tent standing alone on the open steppe, its entrance sealed against the cold night air. Warriors gathered inside as heated stones glow faintly beneath a layer of burning cannabis. Smoke thickens the space, swirling around the figures seated within. At first there is quiet conversation, then perhaps a cough or two as the smoke grows denser. Gradually the mood changes. Someone begins laughing, another joins in, and soon the entire tent echoes with voices raised in excitement. Outside, the wind moves silently across the grasslands, while inside the ritual unfolds in warmth and smoke. In that moment, cannabis was not merely a plant, but a catalyst for communal experience, transforming an ordinary tent into a place of shared intensity. The Scythian ritual reminds us that long before cannabis became associated with modern debates or recreational culture, it was already part of human ceremonies that blended practicality with symbolism. In the smoke-filled tents of the steppe, warriors found both purification and laughter, discovering in the drifting clouds of cannabis something that connected them not only to each other, but to traditions stretching far back into the early history of human interaction with plants. Long before cannabis became associated with ritual smoke or wandering nomadic tribes, it had already found a place in one of the world's oldest medical traditions. In ancient China, the plant was not primarily a mystery or an intoxicant, but a practical and respected part of everyday life. It appeared in fields, in households, and eventually in some of the earliest written records describing plants and their medicinal properties. Among those records is a text traditionally attributed to the legendary Chinese emperor Shen Nong, a figure sometimes described as the father of Chinese herbal medicine. Shen Nong is believed to have lived around 2700 BCE, though historians understand that many of the stories about him blend mythology with fragments of early historical memory. According to Chinese tradition, Shen Nong was a ruler who dedicated himself to understanding the natural world, especially the plants that could be used to treat illness. Stories describe him wandering through forests and valleys, tasting hundreds of herbs in order to document their effects. Some were beneficial, some poisonous, and some required careful preparation to be used safely. The work attributed to him, often referred to as the Shen Nong Pensauqing or Divine Farmer's Classic of Materia Medica, became one of the foundational texts of traditional Chinese medicine. Within this early herbal record appears one of the first known written references to cannabis. In the text, the plant is called ma, a word that would later be used broadly to describe hemp and related species. The entry does not describe the plant as exotic or unusual. Instead, it is presented matter-of-factly as one useful plant among many that could be found in the environment and used for practical purposes. The text explains that parts of the cannabis plant could be used in medicinal preparations, particularly for conditions involving pain or inflammation. Ancient Chinese physicians believed that illness often resulted from imbalances within the body's natural systems. Treatments focused on restoring harmony through herbs that could warm, cool, stimulate, or calm the body, depending on the condition being treated. Cannabis was described as having properties that could ease discomfort and relax the body when used carefully. While modern readers often focus on the psychoactive effects of cannabis, the early Chinese texts showed that its role as a medicine was far more prominent in the earliest historical records. Seeds, leaves, and flowers from the plant were incorporated into herbal mixtures designed to treat a range of conditions. In some cases, cannabis was used to help relieve joint pain or reduce inflammation, which might have been especially valuable for agricultural communities where physical labor was constant. The plant's oils and compounds could produce mild analgesic effects, making it easier for patients to endure injuries or chronic discomfort. In an era long before modern pharmaceuticals, plants like cannabis formed an essential part of the medical toolkit available to healers. The significance of cannabis in ancient China extended far beyond medicine. Hemp, the fiber-rich form of the cannabis plant, was one of the most important crops cultivated by early Chinese societies. Archaeological evidence suggests that hemp cultivation in China dates back thousands of years, possibly even earlier than the written references preserved in herbal texts. Farmers valued hemp because it could grow quickly in many types of soil and produced fibers strong enough to be used in rope, cloth, and other essential materials. In early Chinese villages, hemp fields were as common as fields of grain. The plant's tall stalks provided a reliable source of fiber that could be processed into threads and woven into fabric. Hemp textiles were widely used for clothing, especially among ordinary people who could not afford silk. While silk became famous as a luxury product traded along ancient routes to distant lands, hemp cloth formed the practical backbone of everyday life. It was durable, breathable, and relatively easy to produce compared to more delicate materials. In addition to clothing, hemp fibers were used to make rope, fishing nets, sacks, and many other tools necessary for agricultural and domestic work. One of the most important technological developments in ancient China also depended heavily on hemp. Early forms of paper, invented centuries before paper spread to the rest of the world, were often made using hemp fibers mixed with other plant materials. These fibers created a pulp that could be pressed and dried into thin sheets suitable for writing. Before paper became widespread, writing surfaces such as bamboo strips or silk were used, but both had limitations. Bamboo was heavy and awkward to store, while silk was expensive. Hemp-based paper offered a more practical alternative, allowing written knowledge to circulate more easily within Chinese society. In this way, cannabis indirectly contributed to the preservation and transmission of ideas, playing a role not only in agriculture and medicine, but also in the development of written culture itself. The presence of cannabis in early Chinese herbal texts suggests that people were already familiar with multiple aspects of the plant. Farmers knew how to cultivate hemp for fiber, healers understood how to prepare it for medicinal use, and communities relied on it for practical materials that supported daily life. This wide range of uses made cannabis one of the most versatile plants in ancient China. It was not considered unusual or controversial. Instead, it was simply part of the landscape of useful plants that sustained civilization. While some forms of cannabis may have produced psychoactive effects, ancient Chinese writings rarely emphasize intoxication. In fact, many early medical texts caution that excessive use of certain herbs could lead to undesirable effects, encouraging moderation and careful preparation. This approach reflects the broader philosophy of traditional Chinese medicine, which focused on balance rather than dramatic alteration of consciousness. Cannabis was respected as a plant with potential benefits, but also with properties that needed to be understood properly before use. Over centuries, the cultivation of hemp spread widely across Chinese territory. Fields of the plant became common in rural areas, where farmers harvested the stalks after the growing season and processed them into fibers. The work required skill and patience, as the fibers had to be separated from the woody core of the plant through soaking and drying before they could be spun into thread. Entire communities participated in this process, turning bundles of hemp stalks into rope, cloth, and other goods that supported village life. Because hemp could be grown repeatedly in the same regions, it provided a stable agricultural resource that did not require constant experimentation with new crops. The enduring importance of hemp meant that cannabis remained embedded in Chinese culture for thousands of years. Even as dynasties rose and fell, the plant continued to appear in agricultural records and medical texts. Later scholars and physicians expanded on the herbal knowledge attributed to Shen Nong, documenting additional uses and refining preparation methods. In some cases, cannabis extracts were combined with other herbs to create treatments intended to relieve pain during surgical procedures or ease the symptoms of illness. Although the scientific understanding of plant chemistry was limited in ancient times, practical experience allowed healers to recognize which plants had useful properties and how they might be applied safely. Looking back across the long timeline of Chinese civilization, cannabis appears less as a mysterious drug and more as a foundational crop. Its fibers clothed ordinary people, its seeds provided nourishment, its stalks supplied material for tools, and its medicinal qualities offered relief from physical discomfort. The plant's presence in early herbal texts like those associated with Emperor Shennong reflects this familiarity. It was not something distant or exotic, but a plant growing in the fields and gardens of everyday life. In ancient China, cannabis stood quietly among the many plants that supported human survival. Valued not for altering consciousness, but for the practical and healing roles it played in the development of one of the world's earliest civilizations. As cannabis traveled across Asia through migration, trade, and the quiet spread of agricultural knowledge, it began to take on meanings that went far beyond rope, cloth, or medicine. In India, the plant became woven into something deeper than everyday practicality. It entered religion, mythology, and ritual life in ways that would shape how entire generations understood it. While in ancient China, cannabis often appeared in herbal texts and agricultural records, in India it developed a spiritual identity. The plant was not simply a crop or remedy. It was part of sacred tradition, something connected to the divine, consumed in ceremonies that blended celebration, devotion, and altered consciousness. Among the various ways cannabis has been used in India, one of the most famous is a preparation known as bhang. Unlike smoking or burning the plant, bhang is traditionally consumed as a drink or edible mixture made from the leaves and flowers of cannabis. The preparation process varies by region and family tradition, but the basic idea has remained similar for centuries. Fresh or dried cannabis leaves are ground together with spices, milk, sugar, and sometimes nuts or fruit to create a thick green mixture that can be served as a drink or incorporated into sweets. The result is not simply an intoxicant, but something closer to a ceremonial beverage. Bhang has a long history in India, with references appearing in ancient Sanskrit texts that date back thousands of years. Some scholars believe the use of cannabis in the Indian subcontinent may reach as far back as the Vedic period, around 1500 BCE or earlier, though the exact details remain difficult to confirm because early religious writings often combine mythology and symbolic language. What is clear is that by the time many of the classical Hindu texts were written, cannabis was already familiar enough to be mentioned alongside other sacred plants. Unlike many cultures that treated intoxicating substances with suspicion or strict control, certain strands of Indian tradition accepted cannabis as something that could be used respectfully within religious contexts. In these traditions, bhang was not merely recreational. It was connected to devotion, particularly devotion to one of the most complex and beloved figures in Hindu mythology, the god Shiva. Shiva occupies a unique place in Hindu cosmology. He is often described as both creator and destroyer, a god associated with meditation, transformation, and the cycles of life and death. In many artistic depictions, Shiva appears as an ascetic figure living in the mountains, wearing simple garments, covered in ash, and deep in meditation. Unlike gods who rule heavenly palaces, Shiva is often portrayed wandering in wild places far from civilization. Within this mythology, cannabis became associated with Shiva's lifestyle and spiritual practices. Stories passed down through generations describe Shiva as discovering the cannabis plant while meditating in the wilderness. According to one popular legend, Shiva once sought refuge from the blazing sun beneath the shade of a leafy cannabis plant. Curious about the plant's properties, he tasted its leaves and found that they brought him a sense of calm and clarity. From that moment, the plant became linked with him, earning the nickname Shiva's gift in some traditions. Whether taken literally or symbolically, the story reflects the idea that cannabis was not simply an intoxicant, but something connected to meditation and spiritual insight. The association between Shiva and cannabis also shaped how bhang was consumed during religious festivals. One of the most famous occasions for bhang consumption is the Hindu festival of Holi, sometimes called the Festival of Colors. Holi marks the arrival of spring and celebrates themes of renewal, joy, and the triumph of good over evil. During the festival, streets and villages fill with music, dancing, and clouds of brightly colored powders, thrown playfully between participants. It is a time when social barriers temporarily soften, allowing people of different ages and backgrounds to celebrate together. In many regions, bhang is prepared during Holi and shared among friends and family as part of the festivities. The drink is often mixed into a sweet milk beverage known as thandai, which includes ingredients such as almonds, cardamom, fennel seeds, and rose petals. The result is a drink that feels festive and indulgent even before the cannabis takes effect. Consuming bhang during Holi is traditionally seen as a way of enhancing the joyful spirit of the celebration. The mild psychoactive effects may make colors appear more vivid, music more engaging, and laughter more contagious. blending seamlessly with the playful chaos of the festival itself. The cultural acceptance of bhang in India illustrates an important difference between ritual consumption and casual use. In traditional settings, the drink is usually prepared in communal spaces and consumed in social environments rather than alone. Elders often supervise preparation to ensure that the dosage remains moderate, especially for younger participants who may be experiencing its effects for the first time. The emphasis is not on intoxication for its own sake, but on shared celebration within the boundaries of cultural tradition. This social framework acts as a kind of container, shaping how the substance is experienced and understood. Bhang is not the only form of cannabis used in Indian tradition. Other preparations include ganja, which refers to the dried flowering tops of the plant often smoked in clay pipes known as chillums, and charas, a resin extracted from the plant that can be smoked or mixed into other substances. These forms are sometimes associated with sadhus, wandering holy men who dedicate their lives to spiritual practice and often live outside conventional social structures. Many sadhus consider cannabis a tool that can assist meditation by quieting mental distractions and helping the mind focus inward. For them, the plant becomes part of a disciplined spiritual routine rather than a casual indulgence. Observers visiting sacred sites in India sometimes notice groups of sadhus sitting together, passing a chillum, while chanting or meditating. The smoke rises slowly into the air while prayers are recited and sacred mantras repeated. The moment can appear almost timeless, linking modern observers with traditions that stretch back centuries. In this context, cannabis functions less like a recreational drug and more like incense or ritual fire, a substance that accompanies spiritual practice rather than dominating it. The long relationship between cannabis and Indian culture also reflects the country's broader philosophical traditions. Many schools of Hindu thought emphasize the importance of understanding consciousness and exploring different states of awareness. Meditation, breathing exercises, chanting, and other techniques are designed to help practitioners move beyond ordinary perception and connect with deeper layers of the mind. Cannabis, when used carefully within these traditions, sometimes becomes one more tool in that exploration. It is not considered essential, but it is not automatically rejected either. Instead, its value depends on context and intention. This nuanced approach allowed cannabis to coexist with religious life in India for thousands of years, without the intense stigma seen in some other parts of the world. Even during periods when colonial authorities attempted to regulate or discourage its use, many communities continued to view bhang as part of cultural heritage rather than a dangerous substance. The drink remained especially common during festivals, weddings, and other occasions when celebration and spirituality intersected. Over time, India became one of the regions most closely associated with cannabis in the global imagination, largely because of these visible traditions. Travelers and scholars encountering bhang rituals often wrote detailed descriptions that later spread through books and journals, introducing the idea of sacred cannabis to audiences far beyond the Indian subcontinent. Yet for many Indians, the plant never needed explanation or fascination. It was simply another thread in the complex tapestry of daily life, religion, and seasonal celebration. Within the stories of Shiva and the joyful chaos of Holi, cannabis found a place where laughter, devotion, and ritual blended into a single experience. In India, the plant was not hidden or feared, but honored in specific contexts that gave it meaning beyond intoxication, transforming a simple herb into something that symbolized connection between the human mind and the sacred rhythms of the world. As cannabis moved westward across Asia, carried quietly through migration, trade, and cultural exchange, it eventually entered a region that had long served as one of the world's most important crossroads. The Middle East sat at the intersection of continents, linking East Asia, India, Africa, and Europe through a web of caravan routes and maritime trade networks that would later be known collectively as the Silk Road. Goods, ideas, religions, and technologies moved along these routes for centuries, passing from one culture to another in markets, ports, and desert way stations. Cannabis, like many plants before it, traveled along these same pathways. By the early medieval period, it had become familiar across parts of the Islamic world, where it appeared not as hemp fiber or ceremonial drink, but primarily in the form of a concentrated preparation known as hashish. Unlike the raw leaves used to make bhang in India, Hashish is produced by collecting and compressing the resin that forms on the flowering tops of the cannabis plant. This sticky resin contains higher concentrations of psychoactive compounds than most other parts of the plant. When dried and pressed into small blocks or cakes, hashish can be stored easily and transported over long distances. For traders moving across deserts and mountains, this portability made hashish an ideal commodity. It required relatively small quantities to produce noticeable effects, and could survive the harsh conditions of caravan travel without losing its potency. As trade networks expanded between Central Asia, Persia, and the Arab world, hashish began appearing in cities and settlements throughout the region. Its spread followed the same routes used by spices, textiles, and precious metals, passing from merchants to travelers and eventually into local markets. The popularity of hashish in the medieval Middle East reflected both practical and cultural factors. The climate of many regions within the Islamic world was well suited for growing cannabis plants, particularly in mountainous areas where cooler temperatures and varied soil conditions allowed the plant to flourish. Farmers who already cultivated hemp for fiber or seed could easily experiment with harvesting the resin from certain plants to produce hashish. Over time, specialized methods developed for collecting the resin, including gently rubbing the flowering tops to gather the sticky coating on the hands before scraping it off and compressing it into solid form. These techniques transformed cannabis into a concentrated product that could be traded widely without requiring large bundles of plant material. As hashish spread through markets and social circles, it inevitably attracted attention from scholars and religious authorities within the Islamic world. Islam, like many religious traditions, contained teachings about intoxication and the proper conduct of believers. The Quran explicitly prohibits the consumption of alcohol, referring to it as a substance that clouds judgment and leads people away from moral discipline. This prohibition became an important feature of Islamic culture, shaping attitudes towards substances that might impair the mind. However, cannabis presented a new challenge because it was not mentioned directly in the earliest religious texts. When hashish began appearing more widely in cities across Persia, Egypt, and the Levant, scholars debated whether its effects fell under the same category as alcohol, or whether it represented something different. Some religious authorities argued that any substance capable of altering consciousness should be treated with caution or avoided entirely. From this perspective, the effects of hashish, relaxation, laughter, changes in perception, resembled intoxication, and therefore conflicted with the spiritual discipline encouraged by Islamic teachings. Other scholars took a more nuanced position, noting that the Quran specifically condemned wine and fermented drinks, but did not explicitly address cannabis or similar plants. These debates unfolded in legal writings, sermons, and philosophical discussions that reflected the diversity of thought within the Islamic world. Some communities tolerated hashish use quietly, especially when it occurred in private settings rather than public gatherings. Others attempted to regulate or discourage its consumption, particularly if it was seen as leading to idleness or social disruption. Historical records from medieval cities describe both enthusiasm and concern surrounding the substance. In some places, hashish became associated with certain groups of people, such as laborers, travelers, or mystics, who used it as a way to relax after long journeys or intense work. In other contexts, it appeared in literary works and poetry, where writers described its effects with humor or curiosity. The Middle East during this period was a region of vibrant intellectual life, with scholars translating ancient Greek philosophy, developing mathematical innovations, and exploring medicine and astronomy. Discussions about hashish therefore often took place alongside broader reflections on the nature of consciousness and human behavior. Physicians within the Islamic medical tradition also examined cannabis from a practical perspective. Drawing on earlier Greek and Persian medical knowledge, they studied how plants could influence the body and mind. Some medical texts mention cannabis as a substance that could reduce pain, stimulate appetite, or calm certain conditions when used in small quantities. At the same time, physicians warned that excessive consumption might lead to confusion or lethargy. These observations reflect an early attempt to understand cannabis not simply as a moral issue, but as a substance with specific physiological effects. The debates surrounding hashish did not remain confined to scholarly circles. In some regions, rulers attempted to enforce restrictions on its use, especially if it was believed to encourage disorder in crowded urban areas. Historical accounts mention occasional bans or crackdowns in cities where authorities feared that hashish consumption might interfere with public discipline. However, such restrictions were often difficult to enforce consistently. Like many substances that circulate through trade networks, hashish continued to appear in markets and social spaces even when official attitudes toward it were uncertain. The tension between prohibition and acceptance became a recurring theme throughout the history of cannabis in the Islamic world. One reason hashish remained widespread despite these debates was the social environment in which it was consumed. In many cases, people gathered in small groups to share the substance, often in relaxed settings where conversation, music, or storytelling accompanied the experience. These gatherings were not always formal rituals, but they often carried an element of communal bonding similar to the cannabis traditions seen in other parts of the world. Shared consumption created moments where everyday concerns seemed lighter and conversation flowed more easily. For travelers moving across vast desert landscapes, such moments of camaraderie could be especially meaningful. Caravan journeys could last weeks or months, and the simple act of sitting together after a day's travel while passing around a small amount of hashish might provide a welcome sense of relaxation and connection. Over time, hashish became woven into certain aspects of Middle Eastern culture, appearing in folklore, literature, and everyday life. While alcohol remained prohibited for observant Muslims, hashish occupied a more ambiguous space, sometimes tolerated, sometimes criticized, but rarely ignored entirely. This ambiguity reflects the complexity of the Islamic world itself, where legal traditions, local customs, and individual interpretations often interacted in dynamic ways. The plant that had once grown quietly across the fields of Central Asia had now entered a new cultural landscape, where its meaning was negotiated through trade, scholarship, and daily experience. In the markets of medieval cities, blocks of resin passed from merchant to traveler, carrying with them both the practical legacy of cannabis cultivation and the philosophical questions raised by its effects. The story of cannabis in the Middle East is therefore not simply about a substance spreading along trade routes. It is also about how societies grapple with the presence of something that alters the mind, asking whether such changes belong within the boundaries of tradition or beyond them. By the medieval period, cannabis had already traveled through much of Asia and the Middle East, appearing in markets, farms, and small social gatherings across regions connected by trade. But somewhere along that long journey, the plant became attached to one of the most dramatic and persistent legends in world history, the story of the assassins. The tale has been repeated for centuries, often told in whispers or dramatic retellings about secret warriors who carried out deadly missions after being intoxicated with hashish. According to the story, these warriors belonged to a mysterious order that used cannabis as a tool of control, drugging young recruits and convincing them they had experienced paradise before sending them out on dangerous assignments. It is a story filled with intrigue, exotic imagery, and dark fascination. But like many stories passed down through centuries of travel and storytelling, it sits somewhere between historical reality and imaginative exaggeration. The origin of the legend is usually linked to a group known historically as the Nizari Ismailis, a sect within the broader Islamic world that rose to prominence during the 11th and 12th centuries. Their strongholds were located in mountainous regions of Persia and Syria, where they built fortified castles perched high above surrounding valleys. The most famous of these fortresses was Alamut, a remote citadel nestled in the rugged mountains of northern Persia. From these fortifications, the Nizari community maintained political independence during a period when powerful empires were competing for control of the region. Their leader during the early years of this movement was a man named Hassani Sabah, a figure whose life quickly became surrounded by stories both factual and fictional. Hassani Sabah was known for building a disciplined community centered around loyalty and strategic intelligence. The Nizari Ismailis faced constant threats from rival powers, including the Seljuk Empire and later the Crusader states that arrived from Europe. In response, they developed a form of warfare that relied less on open battle and more on targeted assassinations of political enemies. Small groups of trained agents would infiltrate cities and eliminate specific individuals who threatened their community. These assassinations were often carried out publicly, sometimes in crowded marketplaces or mosques, creating a reputation for precision and fearlessness. To outside observers, this strategy seemed mysterious and unsettling. How could such a small group maintain such influence against larger armies? The answer in reality likely involved careful planning, intelligence networks, and unwavering loyalty among members of the order. But medieval storytellers often preferred more dramatic explanations. Over time, rumors began to circulate that these agents were not simply devoted warriors, but individuals who had been manipulated through drugs and illusions. According to the most famous version of the story, young recruits were given hashish and then brought into a secret garden filled with fountains, music, and beautiful surroundings designed to resemble paradise. When the drug took effect, the recruits believed they had truly entered heaven. Afterward, they were returned to the outside world and told that obedience to their leader would allow them to return to that paradise after death. This, the story claimed, made them fearless in carrying out assassination missions because they believed eternal reward awaited them. The word assassin itself is often said to derive from hashashin, a term that some medieval writers used when describing the group. European travelers encountering these stories during the Crusades brought them back to the West, where they quickly spread through chronicles and popular tales. One of the most famous sources was the Venetian traveler Marco Polo, who described the legendary gardens of paradise and the use of hashish to control followers. His account painted a vivid picture of secret valleys, intoxicating drinks, and warriors completely devoted to their leader because they had tasted heaven itself. For centuries, this story shaped the Western image of the assassins and linked the word hashish permanently with the idea of mysterious and dangerous killers. However, modern historians and scholars who have studied the historical records of the Nizari Ismailis have found little reliable evidence that these dramatic rituals ever actually occurred. The detailed descriptions of hashish-induced visions and hidden gardens appear primarily in accounts written by outsiders, many of whom were political or religious rivals of the Nizaris. These writers had strong reasons to portray the group as fanatical or irrational. In reality, the Nizari Ismailis were known for their intellectual traditions and careful strategic thinking. Their fortress at Alamut became a center of learning, where scholars studied philosophy, mathematics, and theology. The idea that their members were merely drugged followers acting without thought seems inconsistent with the evidence of their sophisticated organization. Many historians now believe that the hashish legend may have originated as propaganda used by enemies who wanted to discredit the group. By suggesting that the assassins relied on drugs to control their followers, critics could portray them as morally corrupt or spiritually misguided. The term hashashin may itself have been used as an insult rather than a literal description of behavior. Over time, these accusations became exaggerated through repeated retelling, especially when they reached European audiences unfamiliar with the complexities of Middle Eastern politics. Stories that began as rumors or slander gradually transformed into accepted legends repeated in books and folklore. This does not mean that cannabis or hashish was entirely absent from the culture of the region. As earlier chapters have shown, hashish was already circulating widely across the Middle East during the medieval period. People used it in social gatherings, sometimes in small quantities for relaxation or contemplation. But the idea that it was systematically used to manipulate assassins into fearless obedience appears unsupported by reliable historical evidence. Instead, the Nizari Ismailis likely relied on ideological commitment and disciplined training to maintain loyalty among their members. The myth of the drugged assassin persists partly because it captures the imagination so vividly. The image of secret gardens and intoxicated warriors feels almost like a story from a fantasy novel, blending mystery, power, and altered states of consciousness into a single narrative. Yet when historians look beyond the legend, the real story becomes more interesting in a different way. It reveals how powerful myths can emerge when cultures misunderstand one another, especially during periods of conflict and limited communication. The Crusades brought European travelers into contact with unfamiliar societies, and the stories they carried home were often shaped by fear, curiosity and exaggeration. Over generations, those stories hardened into legends that overshadowed the more complicated reality. Today, the word assassin still echoes the old legend, carrying with it traces of the medieval belief that drugs and paradise visions lay behind the secret order's actions. But the historical Nizari Ismailis were likely far more pragmatic than the myth suggests. They were a small community navigating a dangerous political landscape, using intelligence and strategic targeting to survive among larger powers. The cannabis plant, which had traveled across continents through trade and culture, became entangled in their story not because it defined their actions, but because storytellers found it a convenient symbol of mystery and control. In this way, the legend of the hashish assassins says as much about human imagination as it does about cannabis itself. A plant once valued for fiber, medicine, and ritual smoke became part of a narrative about manipulation and fanaticism. The story traveled across centuries, shaping language and folklore even as historians continued to question its accuracy. What remains today is a reminder that substances like cannabis often acquire meanings far beyond their chemical effects. They become symbols within cultural stories, sometimes reflecting fear, fascination, or misunderstanding rather than historical truth. Long before cannabis became known for its psychoactive effects or appeared in stories about ritual smoke and medieval legends, it was valued for something far more practical and far more influential in shaping early human civilization. Across large parts of the ancient world, hemp, the fiber-rich variety of the cannabis plant, quietly supported the development of technologies that allowed societies to expand, trade, and build infrastructure. In many ways, hemp functioned as one of the earliest industrial crops, a plant cultivated not primarily for food, but for the materials it could provide. Its tough fibers, durable stalks, and adaptable growing habits made it an ideal resource for communities that needed strong natural materials long before synthetic fibers existed. The role hemp played in early societies is often overlooked because it does not produce dramatic monuments or easily recognizable artifacts like stone temples or metal tools. Yet many of the technologies that allowed civilizations to function depended on materials made from hemp. Rope, sails, nets, textiles, and paper were all products that could be made from the plant's fibers, and each of these materials helped shape the daily operations of ancient economies. Hemp grew quickly and required relatively simple farming techniques, making it a dependable crop in regions where climate conditions allowed it to flourish. Farmers learned that the tall, fibrous stalks of the plant could be harvested annually, processed through soaking and drying, and separated into long strands that could then be twisted or woven into useful forms. Once these techniques were established, hemp became deeply embedded in the infrastructure of early societies. One of the most important uses of hemp fiber appeared in the development of maritime technology. Ships that traveled rivers, seas, and eventually entire oceans relied heavily on rope and cordage to function properly. Hemp rope was particularly valuable because of its strength and resistance to stretching. When twisted into thick lines, the fibers formed ropes capable of holding sails in place, securing cargo, anchoring vessels, and controlling the complex rigging systems required for navigation. Without reliable rope, the sails of early ships could not be adjusted properly to catch wind, and the structural stability of the vessel would be compromised. In many early shipyards, large quantities of hemp were required simply to produce the ropes needed for a single ship. Sailcloth itself was often made from hemp fibers woven into durable fabric, capable of withstanding constant exposure to wind and water. The expansion of maritime trade across ancient and medieval worlds therefore depended heavily on hemp production. Merchants transporting goods across seas relied on ships equipped with ropes, sails, and nets that frequently originated from hemp fields, cultivated far inland. In this sense, the plant contributed indirectly to the growth of global trade networks long before its psychoactive uses attracted attention. While hemp supported the physical movement of people and goods across water, it also played a crucial role in the spread of knowledge through the development of paper. In ancient China, centuries before paper production spread to the rest of the world, early papermakers experimented with different plant fibers to create writing materials that were lighter and more practical than bamboo strips or silk. Hemp fibers proved especially useful for this purpose. When the fibers were softened and broken down into pulp, they could be suspended in water and pressed into thin sheets that dried into strong yet flexible paper. Early Chinese paper often included hemp as a primary ingredient, mixed with other fibers such as mulberry bark or rags from worn textiles. The resulting sheets were durable enough to hold ink and light enough to store in large quantities. This innovation transformed how information was recorded and shared. Instead of carving characters into bamboo or writing on expensive silk, scribes could use paper made from hemp fibers to create books, documents, and administrative records. The spread of paper technology eventually moved westward along trade routes, reaching the Islamic world and later Europe, where it became the foundation of widespread literacy and printed communication. Though many different materials were later used in papermaking, hemp remained one of the early sources of fiber that made the technology possible. The influence of hemp did not stop at ships and paper. Across agricultural societies, the plant functioned as a versatile industrial crop that supported many aspects of daily life. Farmers cultivated hemp fields knowing that every part of the plant could be used in some way. The stalks provided fiber for rope and cloth. The seeds could be pressed for oil or eaten as food, and the leftover plant material could serve as animal bedding or fuel. Hemp textiles were particularly common in regions where other fabrics were expensive or difficult to produce. The cloth woven from hemp fibers was durable and breathable, making it suitable for work garments worn by laborers and farmers. Although silk or wool might be preferred for luxury clothing, hemp fabric remained the practical choice for many everyday uses. In rural communities, entire families often participated in the process of turning harvested hemp into usable materials. After the plants were cut and dried, the fibers needed to be separated from the woody core through a process known as redding, which involved soaking the stalks in water to loosen the fibers. Once separated, the fibers were combed, twisted into thread, and woven into fabric or rope. These activities required patience and skill, but did not depend on complex machinery, making hemp processing accessible to small farming communities. Over time, certain regions became known for producing particularly strong hemp fibers, turning the crop into a valuable commodity that could be traded across long distances. Governments and rulers also recognized the strategic importance of hemp production, especially for naval power. In several historical periods, states encouraged farmers to grow hemp specifically to supply rope and sailcloth for military and merchant fleets. Without large quantities of hemp fiber, ships could not maintain the rigging required for long voyages. The plant therefore became intertwined with national economies and maritime expansion. Fields of hemp in rural landscapes supported fleets of ships that traveled across seas carrying goods, people, and ideas between continents. In this way, a plant growing quietly in agricultural fields helped shape the infrastructure of exploration and trade that connected distant parts of the world. Because hemp was so useful, it often occupied a place alongside staple crops in agricultural planning. Farmers might grow hemp not for direct consumption, but because its fibers could be exchanged for tools, clothing, or other necessities. Markets developed where bundles of hemp fiber were sold to artisans who specialized in rope making, weaving, or paper making. These artisans transformed raw plant material into finished goods that supported the functioning of cities and trade networks. The economic value of hemp therefore extended beyond the farm, creating chains of labor and production that connected growers, craftsmen, merchants, and consumers. Looking across the broader history of civilization, it becomes clear that hemp played a foundational role in many industries long before synthetic materials replaced natural fibers. Its importance rarely appeared in dramatic stories or legends because it functioned as infrastructure rather than spectacle. Rope does not attract attention the way a palace or weapon might. Yet without rope, ships could not sail and heavy materials could not be lifted or secured. Paper might seem ordinary compared to carved stone monuments. Yet without paper, the spread of knowledge and administration would have been far more limited. Hemp supported these technologies quietly, allowing societies to build systems of trade, communication, and production that defined early economies. In this sense, cannabis, through its hemp variety, helped build the early world, not through intoxication or mythology, but through utility. The plant's fibers strengthened the ropes that guided ships across water, formed the cloth that clothed working populations, and helped produce the paper on which scholars recorded ideas that shaped future generations. While later chapters of cannabis history would focus on its psychoactive qualities and cultural debates, the plant's earliest global influence lay in its role as a practical industrial crop. For centuries, fields of hemp stood as silent contributors to human progress, their tall green stalks swaying in the wind, while beneath them the foundations of maritime trade, written knowledge, and agricultural economies quietly took shape. By the time cannabis began appearing regularly in Europe, the plant had already traveled across vast distances and through many different cultures. For thousands of years it had grown in Central Asia, served as fiber in early Chinese agriculture, appeared in ritual traditions in India, and circulated as hashish across the Middle East. Europe, however, encountered cannabis somewhat differently. In the early stages of European contact, the plant was valued less for its psychoactive properties and more for its industrial usefulness. Hemp arrived as a practical crop, something farmers could grow and governments could depend on. Long before the word cannabis carried cultural controversy in Europe, hemp fields were already spread across the countryside, quietly supporting industries that were essential to trade, exploration, and military power. The plant likely entered Europe through a combination of migration and trade routes that stretched across the Eurasian steppe. For centuries, people had been moving westward from Central Asia into the eastern edges of Europe, bringing with them agricultural knowledge and domesticated plants. Hemp was one of those plants. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the early medieval period, hemp was already cultivated in several parts of Eastern Europe, particularly in regions that now include modern-day Ukraine, Russia, and the Balkans. These regions shared ecological similarities with the Central Asian environments where cannabis had originally thrived, making it easy for the plant to adapt and spread. Farmers recognized quickly that hemp could grow reliably in European climates, producing strong fibers useful for rope, textiles, and agricultural tools. As trade routes expanded across Europe during the medieval period, hemp production increased dramatically. Merchants transported goods along rivers and overland caravan routes, linking Eastern Europe to the Mediterranean and the northern seas. These trade networks allowed agricultural practices to spread gradually across the continent. Hemp cultivation followed these same pathways, eventually reaching Western Europe, where it became an important crop in countries such as France, Germany, and England. In these regions, hemp was rarely associated with intoxication. Instead, it was treated primarily as a raw material necessary for everyday infrastructure. European societies during the medieval and early modern periods depended heavily on rope and sailcloth, particularly as maritime exploration began to expand. Ships traveling across rivers, seas, and eventually oceans required enormous quantities of hemp fiber to function properly. Rigging systems used on sailing vessels included hundreds of ropes of varying thickness, each responsible for controlling sails or securing cargo. Sailcloth made from hemp fibers was strong enough to withstand constant exposure to wind and salt water. Without these materials, early European ships would have struggled to survive long voyages. Because of this dependency, many European governments actively encouraged farmers to grow hemp. In some regions, hemp cultivation was even required by law, particularly in countries building large naval fleets. For example, England during the age of maritime expansion placed significant emphasis on hemp production because the Royal Navy required massive amounts of rope and sailcloth. Similar policies existed in other parts of Europe where naval strength depended directly on the availability of hemp fibers. Fields of hemp, therefore, became a familiar sight in rural landscapes, stretching across farmland not for food but for industry. The plant supported shipyards, rope makers, textile workers, and merchants who relied on its fibers for their livelihoods. During this period, cannabis remained primarily an industrial plant in Europe rather than a psychoactive substance widely consumed for its effects. Unlike India or parts of the Middle East, where cannabis had long been associated with ritual or social use, European societies rarely focused on the intoxicating aspects of the plant. The varieties grown for hemp production were often bred for strong fibers rather than high concentrations of psychoactive compounds. As a result, most people encountering cannabis in Europe saw it as a crop similar to flax or cotton, something harvested and processed rather than smoked or consumed. The perception of cannabis began to shift gradually during the 19th century, when European scientists and physicians developed growing interest in plant-based medicines from around the world. The expansion of colonial trade networks allowed doctors and scholars to encounter substances that had been used in traditional medical systems in Asia and the Middle East for centuries. Among these substances was cannabis, particularly the resinous forms used in India and parts of the Islamic world. British physicians working in colonial India were among the first Europeans to study cannabis as a medical treatment. One of the most influential figures in this process was an Irish doctor named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, who served as a medical officer in the British East India Company during the 1830s. While practicing medicine in India, O'Shaughnessy observed how local physicians used cannabis extracts to treat a variety of conditions, including pain, muscle spasms, and digestive disorders. Intrigued by these observations, he began conducting experiments to understand the plant's potential medical applications. O'Shaughnessy tested cannabis preparations in controlled doses, first on animals and later on human patients suffering from conditions such as rheumatism, epilepsy, and severe pain. His findings suggested that cannabis could act as a powerful analgesic and muscle relaxant when administered carefully. In 1839, he published a report describing these medical experiments, introducing cannabis to European medicine in a new way. The report attracted attention among physicians in Britain and across Europe, sparking interest in cannabis as a potential pharmaceutical substance. Soon after O'Shaughnessy's research became known, pharmaceutical companies began producing cannabis extracts that could be sold in pharmacies. These preparations were typically tinctures, meaning the active compounds from the plant were dissolved in alcohol to create a liquid medicine that could be taken in small doses. Doctors prescribed cannabis tinctures for a wide range of conditions including chronic pain, migraines, menstrual discomfort, insomnia, and certain neurological disorders. For many patients, the medicine offered relief during a time when few effective treatments existed for these conditions. Cannabis extracts became a standard item in medical catalogs throughout Europe and North America during the mid-19th century. Pharmacists stocked bottles of cannabis tincture alongside other herbal medicines, and physicians wrote prescriptions without the stigma that would later surround the plant. In medical journals, cannabis was discussed calmly as one option among many plant-derived treatments available to doctors. The plant's long history in Asian medicine gave it credibility among physicians who were increasingly interested in expanding their pharmacological knowledge beyond traditional European herbs. Yet even as cannabis entered European medicine, it remained somewhat mysterious. Scientists at the time did not yet understand the specific chemical compounds responsible for the plant's effects. Without modern laboratory techniques, it was difficult to isolate and measure the active ingredients in cannabis preparations. This meant that tinctures produced by different manufacturers could vary in strength, leading to inconsistent results for patients. Some doctors reported remarkable improvements in symptoms, while others found the effects unpredictable. Despite these uncertainties, cannabis remained widely used in medical practice for several decades. The 19th century therefore marked a turning point in Europe's relationship with cannabis. What had once been seen primarily as an industrial crop began to acquire a second identity as a medicinal substance. European physicians became increasingly aware that the plant contained compounds capable of influencing the nervous system and relieving certain forms of pain. This recognition did not yet lead to widespread recreational use, but it did bring cannabis into the intellectual and scientific discussions of the time. Scholars, pharmacists, and doctors debated how best to prepare the plant, what conditions it could treat, and how its effects compared to other medicines. Through these conversations, cannabis slowly moved from the background of agriculture into the foreground of European medical curiosity. By the late 19th century, the plant had therefore established two distinct roles within European society. On farms, it remained a dependable industrial crop, harvested for fibers that supported shipping, textiles, and manufacturing. In pharmacies, it appeared in glass bottles labeled as medicinal tinctures, prescribed by doctors seeking new ways to treat pain and illness. This dual identity reflected the long journey cannabis had taken from its origins in Central Asia to the laboratories and hospitals of Europe. The plant that once grew wild along ancient trade routes had now become part of both industry and medicine, quietly shaping European history long before the controversies of the 20th century would transform its reputation. By the middle of the 19th century, cannabis had quietly entered European medical practice, not as a mysterious foreign substance, but as a legitimate pharmaceutical ingredient that could be found on the shelves of respectable pharmacies. In Victorian Britain and across parts of Europe, cannabis was commonly sold in the form of tinctures, liquid extracts of the plant dissolved in alcohol and carefully measured for medicinal use. These tinctures were part of a broader tradition of herbal medicine that had dominated European healthcare for centuries, before the rise of modern pharmaceuticals. Doctors and pharmacists relied on plant extracts to treat a wide variety of conditions, and cannabis joined a long list of botanical remedies that included opium, belladonna, foxglove, and willow bark. Within this context, cannabis was not viewed with suspicion or controversy. It was simply another medicinal substance whose effects physicians were still learning to understand. Pharmacies during the Victorian era often resembled small laboratories filled with glass bottles, brass scales, and handwritten labels identifying the contents of various herbal preparations. Apothecaries carefully measured powders, tinctures, and oils according to the prescriptions written by doctors. Cannabis tincture, sometimes labeled as extractum cannabis indicae or tinctura cannabis, appeared in many of these dispensaries. The name cannabis indica referred to varieties of the plant imported from India, which were believed to contain stronger medicinal properties than the hemp grown in Europe for fiber. Pharmaceutical companies began manufacturing standardized cannabis extracts so doctors could prescribe more consistent doses. One of the most influential companies involved in producing cannabis medicines was the British pharmaceutical firm Park Davis, which distributed cannabis extracts widely during the late 19th century. Their catalogs described cannabis tinctures as treatments for neuralgia, migraine headaches, muscle spasms, insomnia, and various forms of chronic pain. For patients suffering from conditions that had few effective remedies at the time, these preparations offered at least some relief. The effects of cannabis tinctures were typically described as calming rather than intoxicating when used in moderate doses. Doctors observed that the medicine could reduce certain kinds of pain while allowing patients to remain alert enough to continue daily activities. This made it particularly appealing compared to stronger narcotics, such as opium, which often caused heavy sedation and dependency. Cannabis was therefore sometimes seen as a gentler alternative within the medical community. Medical journals of the period included discussions about how cannabis could be used to treat nervous disorders, menstrual discomfort, and even symptoms associated with certain neurological conditions. Physicians experimented with different doses and delivery methods, sometimes combining cannabis extracts with other herbal ingredients to enhance their effects. Although the scientific understanding of cannabis chemistry was still limited, doctors relied on clinical observation and patient feedback to guide their prescriptions. In hospitals and private clinics, cannabis tinctures were administered in small measured drops mixed with water or tea. Patients experiencing chronic pain or muscle spasms might receive these drops several times a day under medical supervision. The atmosphere surrounding cannabis during the Victorian period was remarkably calm compared to later decades when the plant would become controversial. There were no dramatic warnings or moral panic associated with its use in medicine. Instead, it was treated as one more tool available to physicians seeking ways to ease suffering in an era when medical options were often limited. Among the most frequently repeated stories from this period is the claim that Queen Victoria herself used cannabis tincture to relieve menstrual pain. The story centers around her personal physician, Sir John Russell Reynolds, a respected neurologist who served as the Queen's doctor for many years. Reynolds was known for his interest in innovative treatments and wrote positively about cannabis in several medical publications. In an article published in the British medical journal The Lancet in 1890, Reynolds described cannabis as a valuable medicine for treating certain types of pain, particularly those related to muscular or nervous conditions. Because Reynolds treated Queen Victoria during the height of her reign, later writers began to speculate that he might have prescribed cannabis tincture for her personal use. While definitive documentation of the Queen's prescription records is limited, The association between Reynolds's writings and his royal patient helped create one of the most enduring anecdotes in the history of cannabis medicine. Whether or not Queen Victoria personally relied on cannabis tincture, the fact that such a story could circulate without scandal reveals how normal the medicine had become in Victorian society. Cannabis was not considered rebellious or dangerous. It was discussed in the same calm language used for other herbal remedies of the time. If a respected physician recommended it for pain relief, patients were generally willing to try it without hesitation. This attitude reflected the broader medical culture of the 19th century, when doctors were actively exploring plant-based compounds in search of effective treatments. The Victorian era was a time of intense scientific curiosity. Advances in chemistry and pharmacology were beginning to transform medicine from a tradition based largely on herbal lore into a more systematic scientific discipline. Researchers were isolating active compounds from plants and studying how they affected the human body. Morphine had recently been extracted from opium, revolutionizing pain management, and scientists were investigating other botanical substances with similar potential. Cannabis attracted interest because it appeared to offer therapeutic benefits without some of the extreme side effects associated with stronger narcotics. However, the plant also posed challenges for researchers. Unlike morphine, which could be isolated as a single chemical compound, cannabis contained a complex mixture of substances that were difficult to separate with the laboratory techniques available at the time. This made it harder to standardize cannabis medicines. Two tinctures prepared from different plants might produce slightly different effects, creating uncertainty about dosing. Doctors sometimes reported inconsistent results when prescribing cannabis extracts, which led some members of the medical community to question its reliability compared to more easily standardized drugs. Despite these limitations, cannabis remained part of Victorian medicine for several decades. Pharmacies continued selling tinctures and extracts, and doctors continued writing prescriptions for patients who might benefit from its calming and analgesic effects. Advertisements for patent medicines sometimes included cannabis as an ingredient, promoting it as a remedy for nervous exhaustion or digestive discomfort. While these claims were not always scientifically rigorous, they reflected the general acceptance of cannabis as a legitimate medicinal plant. The presence of cannabis in Victorian healthcare also highlights how attitudes towards substances can change dramatically over time. In the 19th century, the plant was integrated into mainstream medicine with relatively little controversy. Doctors debated its effectiveness, but rarely framed it as a moral threat to society. The social and political factors that would later lead to strict prohibition had not yet emerged. Instead, cannabis existed quietly in the background of medical practice, used when necessary and largely ignored when other treatments proved more effective. Looking back at the Victorian era reveals a period when cannabis was neither celebrated nor condemned, but simply utilized. In the quiet pharmacies of London and other European cities, small bottles of tincture stood alongside countless other remedies intended to ease the discomforts of everyday life. Physicians like Sir John Russell Reynolds considered the plant worthy of study and occasionally useful in treating pain. Patients seeking relief from headaches, cramps, or nervous conditions might receive a carefully measured dose of cannabis extract without any sense that they were participating in something controversial. For a brief moment in medical history, cannabis occupied a place of quiet respectability, its reputation shaped not by politics or fear, but by the practical question that guided all 19th century medicine. Could this plant help someone feel better? For much of the 19th century, cannabis existed quietly within Western medicine and agriculture, rarely attracting the kind of attention that would lead to controversy or fear. Doctors prescribed tinctures, farmers cultivated hemp for fiber, and the plant remained largely outside the political debates that surrounded other substances like alcohol. But as the 20th century approached, attitudes toward drugs and social behavior began to shift dramatically. Governments in Europe and the United States started developing new laws aimed at regulating substances that could alter the mind. These changes were influenced by a complex mixture of public health concerns, social anxiety, and political motivations. In this environment, cannabis gradually moved from being a relatively ordinary medicinal plant to becoming something increasingly associated with danger and moral panic. The transformation did not happen overnight. Instead, it unfolded slowly through a series of legal changes, cultural campaigns, and misunderstandings that reshaped how society perceived the plant. At the beginning of the 20th century, many Western countries were already becoming concerned about the growing availability of narcotics, such as opium and cocaine. These substances had been widely used in medicine during the previous century, but were now associated with addiction and social problems. Governments responded by introducing regulations designed to control how drugs could be sold and distributed. In the United States, one of the earliest major drug laws was the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, which regulated the sale of opiates and cocaine by requiring doctors and pharmacists to register and pay taxes for prescribing them. While cannabis was not the primary focus of this legislation, the law marked an important turning point in how governments approached drug control. Substances that had once been treated simply as medicines were now being placed under increasing scrutiny. During the same period, cannabis itself began to appear in new cultural contexts that influenced how it was perceived by the public. In the United States, the plant became associated with immigrant communities, particularly Mexican laborers who arrived in the early 20th century. Following political upheaval in Mexico, many of these workers brought with them the tradition of smoking marijuana, a term derived from the Spanish word marijuana. While cannabis extracts had previously been sold in American pharmacies without much attention, the practice of smoking the plant was unfamiliar to many Americans and quickly became the subject of suspicion. Newspapers and local authorities began linking marijuana use with crime and disorder, often exaggerating its effects in ways that played upon existing social prejudices. These early reports rarely relied on scientific evidence. Instead, they focused on sensational stories that portrayed marijuana as a dangerous new threat capable of transforming ordinary people into violent criminals. Such claims were often rooted in racial stereotypes rather than careful observation. Mexican immigrants and other minority communities were frequently depicted in newspaper headlines as sources of social instability, and marijuana became entangled in those narratives. The plant itself was not the real focus of fear. Rather, it served as a symbol within broader anxieties about immigration, cultural change, and shifting social boundaries. By associating cannabis with marginalized groups, political leaders and media outlets found a convenient way to frame the substance as something foreign and dangerous. Local governments in several American states responded by introducing laws specifically targeting marijuana. Some of the earliest bans appeared in border states such as Texas and California during the 1910s and 1920s. These laws often emerged in communities where tensions between established residents and immigrant laborers were already high. Officials claimed that prohibiting marijuana would help maintain order and prevent crime, even though evidence linking the plant to violence remained weak. Once these local bans were in place, they began influencing discussions at the national level. Politicians and law enforcement agencies argued that a unified federal approach was needed to control the spread of marijuana across state lines. The campaign to criminalize cannabis intensified during the 1930s when the United States government created the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, an agency tasked with enforcing drug laws and shaping public policy on narcotics. The Bureau's first commissioner, Harry Anslinger, became one of the most influential figures in the early history of marijuana prohibition. Anslinger believed strongly that cannabis represented a social danger and began promoting that view through speeches, reports, and public campaigns. Under his leadership, the Bureau collected stories linking marijuana use to extreme acts of violence or insanity. Many of these stories were later criticized for being exaggerated or unsupported by reliable evidence, but at the time they were widely circulated through newspapers and radio broadcasts. Sensational headlines warned that marijuana could cause madness, criminal behavior, and moral decay. One of the most famous examples of this propaganda was the 1936 film Reefer Madness, which depicted marijuana as a substance capable of driving young people into uncontrollable violence and insanity. Although the film was originally intended as a cautionary educational piece, its dramatic portrayal reflected the broader atmosphere of fear surrounding cannabis during that era. Audiences were shown exaggerated scenes of chaos meant to convince viewers that marijuana posed an immediate threat to society. Such messages reinforced the idea that strict laws were necessary to protect communities from the perceived dangers of the drug. This climate of fear culminated in the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 in the United States. Rather than banning cannabis outright, the law imposed heavy taxes and complex regulations on anyone involved in its production, sale, or possession. Doctors, pharmacists, and farmers were required to obtain special permits and pay significant fees to handle cannabis legally. In practice, these requirements were so burdensome that most people simply stopped dealing with the plant altogether. Medical prescriptions declined sharply, and hemp farmers found it increasingly difficult to continue cultivating their crops. Although the law was framed as a tax measure, its effect was essentially to criminalize marijuana across the country. The United States was not the only place where cannabis prohibition began to emerge during the early 20th century. International agreements aimed at controlling narcotics gradually expanded to include cannabis as well. At conferences organized under the League of Nations, delegates from various countries discussed ways to regulate substances that might circulate through global trade networks. By the 1920s and 1930s, cannabis had been added to lists of drugs considered worthy of international control. These agreements encouraged governments around the world to adopt similar restrictions, spreading prohibition beyond the borders of any single nation. The shift toward criminalization represented a dramatic change in how cannabis was understood. A plant that had once appeared in medical texts and agricultural manuals was now being portrayed as a dangerous substance requiring strict legal penalties. This transformation did not occur solely because of new scientific discoveries about cannabis. Instead, it reflected a complex mixture of social fears, political agendas, and cultural misunderstandings. Racialized propaganda played a significant role in shaping public perception, linking marijuana to marginalized communities and presenting it as a symbol of social disorder. Once these narratives became widely accepted, laws followed quickly. By the middle of the 20th century, cannabis had been pushed to the margins of legal society in many parts of the world. Doctors who once prescribed tinctures rarely mentioned the plant anymore, and hemp cultivation declined sharply as farmers turned to other crops. The history of cannabis prohibition therefore illustrates how quickly attitudes toward a substance can change when cultural fears combine with political action. In the span of only a few decades, a plant that had been quietly integrated into medicine and industry was transformed into an object of suspicion and criminal law, setting the stage for decades of debate that would continue long into the future. By the middle of the 20th century, cannabis had already traveled a long and complicated path through human history. It had been a fiber crop, a medicine, a ritual substance, and eventually the target of prohibition laws that transformed it into something illegal in many parts of the world. Yet laws rarely erase a plant from culture entirely. Instead, they often change how that plant is perceived and who chooses to use it. During the decades following the Second World War, cannabis remained present in small social circles, often among musicians, artists, and communities living at the edges of mainstream society. In the United States, jazz musicians were among the early groups known for using marijuana during the 1940s and 1950s, describing it as something that helped them relax, improvise, and enter a more fluid creative state. These circles remained relatively small and discreet because strict drug laws made open discussion risky. But beneath the surface of American society, cultural changes were beginning to gather momentum. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, a new generation of young people began questioning the political and social structures that had shaped the post-war world. Many felt alienated by the rigid expectations of suburban life, Cold War anxieties, and a culture that emphasized conformity over personal exploration. Universities expanded rapidly during this period, bringing together large numbers of students who were exposed to new ideas about politics, philosophy, and art. Books discussing Eastern spirituality, psychology, and alternative ways of living circulated widely among young readers who were searching for something beyond the routine of career and consumerism that defined much of mid-century life. Within this environment, cannabis began to acquire a new meaning. Instead of being viewed primarily as a dangerous narcotic or obscure plant, it became associated with curiosity, experimentation, and the desire to question authority. The emerging youth movement of the 1960s, often referred to as the counterculture, embraced symbols that represented freedom from established norms. Music, clothing, art, and language all changed rapidly during this period, reflecting a generation eager to reshape the social landscape. Cannabis, once hidden in small underground circles, gradually became one of the most recognizable symbols of this cultural shift. The communities most closely associated with the early counterculture came to be known as hippies. The term itself began as a label applied to young people who rejected mainstream values and sought alternative lifestyles centered around peace, communal living, and creative expression. Many of these individuals gathered in urban neighborhoods such as San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, where artists, musicians, and students created a vibrant environment of shared ideas and experimentation. In these spaces, cannabis was commonly used as part of social gatherings where music, conversation, and art blended together. Smoking marijuana became less about intoxication alone and more about participating in a collective atmosphere that encouraged open discussion and emotional connection. For many participants, cannabis represented a gentle alternative to alcohol, which had long been associated with more aggressive or destructive behavior in social settings. The relationship between cannabis and music played a particularly important role in spreading its cultural influence. The 1960s witnessed an explosion of new musical styles ranging from folk and rock to psychedelic experimentation. Artists such as Bob Dylan, the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, and many others became voices of a generation that questioned war, authority, and social inequality. Lyrics began exploring themes of consciousness, personal freedom, and the search for meaning beyond conventional boundaries. Cannabis often appeared within this environment as part of the creative process or as a symbol of the broader cultural awakening taking place. Large outdoor concerts and festivals brought thousands of young people together in shared spaces where music, art, and communal living created a sense of temporary freedom from ordinary social rules. The most famous of these gatherings occurred in 1969 at the Woodstock Music and Art Fair in upstate New York. For several days, hundreds of thousands of people camped in open fields, while musicians performed on a simple stage surrounded by mud, rain, and an atmosphere of collective enthusiasm. Cannabis was widely present at events like Woodstock, but it was rarely the central focus. Instead, it functioned as one element within a much larger cultural moment, defined by ideals of peace, creativity, and resistance to authority. Participants often described these gatherings as moments when strangers felt connected through shared experience rather than divided by social hierarchy. At the same time, the counterculture movement became increasingly linked with political activism, particularly opposition to the Vietnam War. As the conflict escalated during the 1960s, protests erupted across American campuses and city streets. Many young people viewed the war as a symbol of government decisions made without regard for human life or moral responsibility. Demonstrations calling for peace often merged with broader critiques of political power and corporate influence. Within these protests, cannabis sometimes appeared as a quiet act of defiance against laws that participants believed were unjust or hypocritical. If authorities claimed that marijuana represented moral corruption, some activists deliberately used it as a symbol of personal autonomy, arguing that individuals should have the freedom to make their own choices about consciousness and lifestyle. This transformation of cannabis into a symbol of rebellion deeply concerned many political leaders and law enforcement agencies. Officials worried that the widespread visibility of marijuana within youth culture signaled a broader challenge to authority. As a result, governments intensified efforts to enforce drug laws, framing marijuana use as part of a larger social problem connected to crime and disorder. Public statements often warned that cannabis served as a gateway to more dangerous substances, a claim that was widely debated among scientists and policymakers. The tension between countercultural communities and government institutions became one of the defining features of the era. Police raids, arrests, and public campaigns against drug use occurred alongside music festivals and peaceful protests calling for social change. Despite these conflicts, cannabis continued spreading throughout youth culture during the late 1960s and early 1970s. College campuses became environments where experimentation with new ideas and lifestyles was common. For For many students, marijuana represented not only a recreational experience but also a subtle statement about rejecting older social rules that seemed disconnected from the realities of modern life. The plant that had once been hidden within underground circles now appeared openly in music, art, and conversation among millions of young people. Its meaning had shifted once again, this time becoming intertwined with a broader cultural movement that challenged political authority and explored new ways of understanding consciousness. Looking back on this period, historians often describe the counterculture explosion as a moment when cannabis became more than just a substance. It evolved into a cultural symbol that represented curiosity, dissent, and the search for alternative ways of living. The hippie movement itself eventually faded as economic pressures and political changes reshaped society during the 1970s. Yet the image of cannabis as a marker of rebellion remained powerful long after the music festivals ended and the communal houses dispersed. The plant's association with the counterculture era ensured that future debates about marijuana would involve not only questions of law and medicine, but also deeper discussions about freedom, authority, and the boundaries of personal choice within modern society. By the early 1970s, cannabis had already become deeply entangled with youth culture, protest movements, and the broader social changes that reshaped much of the Western world during the previous decade. To many political leaders, this transformation appeared alarming. Marijuana was no longer a little-known plant hidden in medical texts or quietly grown as hemp in agricultural fields. It had become a visible symbol of counterculture and dissent. Governments that were already uneasy about the cultural turbulence of the 1960s began responding with stronger policies designed to reassert control over drug use. Out of this political climate emerged what would eventually be known as the War on Drugs, a long and complex campaign that reshaped criminal law, policing, and incarceration across several countries, particularly the United States. The phrase itself entered public discourse in 1971 when U.S. President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse to be public enemy number one. In a speech announcing a new federal strategy for drug control, Nixon described drug use as a threat not only to individual health, but to the stability of American society. The government began expanding law enforcement efforts aimed at identifying and prosecuting individuals involved with illegal substances, including marijuana. While earlier decades had already introduced prohibition laws, the war on drugs dramatically intensified the scale and severity of enforcement. Cannabis remained classified as a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, a category reserved for drugs considered to have high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. This classification placed marijuana in the same legal category as heroin and LSD. Despite ongoing debates within the scientific community about its relative risks, once cannabis occupied that category, possession and distribution could lead to severe criminal penalties depending on the circumstances. Over time, these laws created a system in which even relatively small amounts of marijuana could result in arrest, prosecution, and long-term legal consequences. During the 1980s, the war on drugs expanded further under President Ronald Reagan, whose administration introduced policies that increased penalties for drug-related offenses and encouraged aggressive enforcement at both federal and state levels. One of the most influential pieces of legislation during this period was the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which established mandatory minimum sentences for various drug crimes. Mandatory minimums meant that judges were required to impose specific prison terms once certain thresholds were met, limiting their ability to consider individual circumstances when sentencing defendants. Although these laws targeted many substances, cannabis possession and distribution were often included within the broader framework of drug enforcement. Police departments received increased funding to conduct drug investigations, and specialized units were created to pursue narcotics offenses in cities and rural areas alike. The escalation of enforcement led to a sharp rise in arrests related to marijuana possession. In many communities, police officers conducted routine patrols focused on identifying individuals suspected of carrying small amounts of cannabis. Because marijuana is relatively easy to detect by smell and simple to identify visually, it became one of the most common reasons for drug-related arrests. These arrests did not always involve large trafficking networks or organized criminal operations. In many cases, they involved ordinary citizens caught with small quantities of the plant. Yet the legal system treated these violations seriously, and repeated offenses could lead to significant jail time. As enforcement intensified, the number of people entering the criminal justice system for drug-related offenses increased dramatically. By the late 20th century, millions of arrests had been made for marijuana possession in the United States alone. Many individuals charged under these laws received criminal records that affected their ability to find employment, secure housing, or pursue education. The cumulative effect of these policies was the growth of prison populations across the country. Correctional facilities expanded rapidly to accommodate the increasing number of inmates convicted of drug offenses. Although cannabis was only one part of the broader war on drugs, its widespread use meant that it contributed significantly to the overall scale of arrests and prosecutions. The rise in incarceration rates during this period became one of the most controversial aspects of drug policy. Critics argued that the harsh penalties imposed for relatively minor offenses were disproportionate and failed to address the underlying social factors associated with drug use. Researchers began documenting how enforcement practices varied between communities, with some neighborhoods experiencing far higher rates of police surveillance and arrest than others. Studies suggested that minority populations were often affected more heavily by drug enforcement despite similar levels of marijuana use across different demographic groups. These disparities fueled debates about whether the war on drugs was achieving its intended goals or creating new social problems through mass incarceration. Meanwhile, supporters of strict enforcement argued that strong laws were necessary to discourage drug use and maintain public order. They maintained that without firm legal consequences, the availability of illegal substances would expand and create greater harm within communities. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, this debate intensified as policymakers struggled to balance public health concerns with questions of fairness and effectiveness in criminal law. Media campaigns during this era reinforced the government's anti-drug message. Public service announcements warned young people about the dangers of drug use, often portraying marijuana as a gateway substance that could lead to more serious addiction. Schools introduced educational programs designed to discourage experimentation with drugs, emphasizing abstinence as the safest approach. These messages reflected a broader belief among many leaders that reducing drug use required both strict enforcement and strong cultural discouragement. Yet even as these campaigns continued, surveys indicated that marijuana remained one of the most commonly used illegal substances in the United States and other parts of the world. The persistence of cannabis use despite decades of prohibition raised new questions about the effectiveness of existing policies. Some policymakers began exploring alternatives such as decriminalization, which would reduce or eliminate criminal penalties for possession of small amounts while still prohibiting large-scale distribution. Others suggested focusing more on treatment and education rather than incarceration. These discussions gradually gained traction toward the end of the 20th century as researchers and lawmakers examined the long-term consequences of the war on drugs. By the early 21st century, the scale of mass incarceration associated with drug enforcement had become a central topic in political debates about criminal justice reform. Advocates argued that decades of strict policies had filled prisons without significantly reducing the availability of drugs, while opponents warned that loosening restrictions might encourage greater use. Within this broader conversation, cannabis played a particularly important role because of its widespread presence and relatively lower risk profile compared to some other substances. As more scientific research emerged examining the medical potential and health effects of cannabis, public attitudes began shifting once again. The war on drugs had transformed marijuana from a countercultural symbol into a heavily policed criminal offense, but the debate surrounding that transformation was far from settled. Looking back, the period of harsh penalties and expanding incarceration marked one of the most consequential chapters in the modern history of cannabis. Laws designed to control drug use reshaped legal systems, policing practices, and prison populations for decades. For many individuals, the consequences of those policies extended far beyond a single arrest, influencing entire communities and generations of families. The war on drugs therefore stands as a powerful example of how government strategies aimed at regulating substances can produce effects that reach deeply into the social fabric of a nation, altering lives in ways that continue to be examined and debated today. By the early 21st century, the long story of cannabis had reached another turning point. For decades, the plant had been shaped by prohibition, political fear, and aggressive law enforcement. Laws created during the war on drugs had placed cannabis firmly within the category of dangerous narcotics, and millions of arrests had reinforced that legal framework across several generations. Yet history has a tendency to circle back on itself. The same plant that once appeared quietly in 19th century pharmacies and ancient medical texts began slowly returning to public conversation, this time through a new combination of scientific research, medical advocacy, and shifting public attitudes. What had once been treated almost entirely as a criminal issue was gradually re-examined as a matter of medicine, economics, and personal freedom. The return of cannabis into legal and cultural spaces did not happen all at once. Instead, it unfolded gradually through small policy changes that reflected growing skepticism about earlier prohibition strategies. One of the first major developments occurred in the 1990s, when several regions began reconsidering whether cannabis might have legitimate medical uses. Patients suffering from chronic illnesses such as cancer, multiple sclerosis, and severe epilepsy reported that cannabis helped relieve symptoms including pain, nausea, and muscle spasms when conventional medications failed to provide adequate relief. These reports drew attention from doctors and researchers who began investigating the plant more closely. Scientific interest grew particularly after the discovery of the endocannabinoid system in the human body during the late 20th century. Researchers found that the body naturally produces chemical compounds similar to those found in cannabis, and that these compounds interact with receptors throughout the brain and nervous system. This discovery helped explain why cannabis could influence pain perception, appetite, mood, and other physiological processes. As evidence accumulated, public discussions about cannabis began shifting away from simple moral judgments toward more nuanced questions about medical benefit and responsible regulation. In 1996, the U.S. state of California became one of the first jurisdictions in the modern era to legalize cannabis for medical use through a voter initiative known as Proposition 215. The law allowed patients with certain conditions to obtain cannabis with a physician's recommendation. At the time, the decision was controversial, with critics warning that it would undermine national drug laws. Yet the measure also reflected the growing frustration among patients who believed they should have access to treatments that improved their quality of life. Over the following years, other states and countries began adopting similar policies. Each new law represented a small step in rethinking how cannabis should be treated within legal systems that had previously prohibited it entirely. Medical cannabis programs typically included regulations designed to control how the plant could be produced and distributed. Licensed growers cultivated cannabis in controlled environments, while dispensaries operated under strict guidelines to ensure that products were sold only to authorized patients. Doctors monitored patient conditions and recommended cannabis when they believed it might provide relief. These programs created a new category within drug policy, separating medical use from recreational consumption and allowing governments to gather data about how the plant affected public health. As research expanded, scientists studied various compounds within cannabis, particularly cannabinoids such as THC and CBD. THC was known for producing the psychoactive effects commonly associated with marijuana, while CBD attracted attention for its potential therapeutic properties without strong intoxicating effects. Pharmaceutical companies began developing medications derived from cannabinoids, and clinical trials explored how these compounds might treat conditions ranging from epilepsy to chronic pain disorders. The growing body of scientific literature encouraged policymakers to reconsider earlier assumptions about the plant's medical value. Meanwhile, public attitudes toward cannabis were changing rapidly. Surveys conducted across many countries showed that younger generations in particular were less likely to view marijuana as a dangerous substance compared with previous decades. Cultural perceptions shifted as well. The plant that had once symbolized rebellion during the counterculture era now appeared in discussions about healthcare, taxation, and economic opportunity. Entrepreneurs began exploring how regulated cannabis industries might create jobs and generate government revenue through licensing and taxation. These economic arguments played a significant role in debates about legalization. Some policymakers concluded that regulating cannabis openly might prove more effective than maintaining prohibition systems that had failed to eliminate its use. Beginning in the early 2010s, several jurisdictions moved beyond medical programs to legalize cannabis for adult recreational use. In 2012, voters in the U.S. states of Colorado and Washington approved initiatives allowing adults to possess and purchase cannabis within regulated markets. These decisions represented a major shift in drug policy, effectively reversing decades of strict prohibition at the state level. Other regions soon followed, including Canada, which legalized cannabis nationwide in 2018, becoming one of the first major industrialized countries to do so. Governments adopting legalization policies generally implemented detailed regulatory frameworks designed to control production, sales, and public consumption. Licensed businesses cultivated cannabis under strict quality standards, laboratories tested products for safety, and retail stores operated similarly to alcohol retailers with age restrictions and purchase limits. Tax revenues generated from cannabis sales were often directed toward public programs such as education, healthcare, or substance abuse prevention. These new legal markets did not eliminate every controversy surrounding cannabis, but they marked a significant departure from the criminalization policies of earlier decades. At the same time, global attitudes toward the plant continued evolving. Countries across Europe, Latin America, and parts of Asia began reconsidering their own cannabis laws, sometimes decriminalizing possession or allowing limited medical use. International organizations that had once supported strict prohibition frameworks started re-evaluating scientific evidence regarding the plant's risks and benefits. Discussions emerged about how international drug treaties should adapt to reflect modern research and changing social perspectives. The debate surrounding cannabis remained complex, balancing concerns about public health with arguments for personal autonomy and medical access. Some critics warned that legalization might increase use among vulnerable populations or create new regulatory challenges. Others argued that careful regulation provided an opportunity to reduce black markets and improve consumer safety by ensuring product quality. Despite these disagreements, the overall trend pointed toward greater openness in discussing cannabis policy compared with the rigid prohibition environment of the late 20th century. Looking at the broader arc of history, the re-emergence of cannabis into legal society represents another chapter in the long relationship between humans and this remarkably adaptable plant. For thousands of years, cannabis had shifted roles repeatedly: fiber crop, medicine, ritual substance, industrial material, criminalized drug, and now once again a topic of scientific research and legal reform. Each stage of that journey reflected the values and anxieties of the societies interacting with it. In the modern era, cannabis returned not through myth or rebellion, but through careful policy debates, patient advocacy, and expanding scientific knowledge. Governments, doctors, researchers, and citizens found themselves reconsidering assumptions inherited from previous generations. The plant that had once been pushed to the margins of legality was gradually stepping back into public life, carrying with it both the weight of its complicated past and the possibilities of a future still being written.